Hosein has called Art After Indenture. So for those of you that are coming in on YouTube, who are coming in on other platforms such as Facebook, welcome. Welcome to all. The Botanical Afterlife of Indenture is an exhibit that I created in June of this year, actually called the Botanical Afterlife of Indenture Imaginative Archives. And both leading up to it and following it, I've been interested in having a number of conversations with artists who are producing work about indenture, Indian women's histories, the botanical. And I'm joined today by Zenaéca Singh from South Africa. And while this is a Botanical Afterlife of Indenture Imaginative Archives series, our title for today is Acts of Sugar, Finding a Sweet Escape, which represents Zenaéca's work. I'm just going to, hi Zenaéca, welcome. Zenaéca is joining us from South Africa.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's so lovely to be doing this with you today.
I'm excited. And let me just introduce you to Zenaéca. Zenaéca completed her Masters of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town's McKellis School of Fine Art in 2024, where she also received multiple awards for her BFA. She's an Accelerated Transformation of the Academic Program Fellow, and selected exhibitions include Greatest Hits, in collaboration with the Association of Visual Arts at the Lewinhof Slave Lodge Remembrance Gallery. Recent exhibitions include Entangled, 2024 and ongoing, with Guns and Rain at Oxford Rhodes House, along with MFA solo exhibition Browning in the Archive, 2024 at the McAllis Galleries, and All Directions, 2025 at Phoenix Museum. I'd also like to thank Ryan Jobson for putting Zenaéca and I in touch. Ryan is here, and to say thanks for that. And also to thank Jordash Elapen, also from South Africa, and who just managed to mention Zenaéca's work at the same time. And so it's lovely to be in conversation with you, Zenaéca. Welcome, welcome. Before I ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and about the work that you'll be discussing today, I just want to tell our audience a little bit about why we are in conversation today in the way that we are. And that is because the work that I began to think about, which is how does the botanical figure in our histories and also in our contemporary lives as part of our acts of memorialization, led me to look at the work that others are producing, also using the botanical. And today we'll be discussing Zenaéca's use of sugar. Sugar, of course, coming from sugarcane, which is an overdetermining plant that has been associated with indenture history. In this series, we started with Gabrielle Hosein, who really has played a pivotal and leading role in establishing the field of art after indenture, both in terms of his own work, but also in terms of curation. I also want to mention the kinds of scholarship that has been existing, the work of Professor Patricia Mohammed, the work of Professor Rhoda Reddock, the work of numerous scholars since those founding years, who have also been thinking about indentured women's labor, lives, and resistance. And of course, that work becomes something that we draw on in so many ways. And also to just acknowledge that there are many artists out there who are producing what I'm calling here imaginative archives, and hoping that this is seen as part of very broad and complex and diverse work that is being produced transoceanically, in which there are also connections between Fiji, the Caribbean, South Africa, and other sites. And that exploring these transoceanic connections is part of my wider post-indenture feminist project. And so that's how we came to be here today. Zenaeìca, I'm going to hand over to you and just ask you, tell us a little bit about yourself, growing up, living, coming to consciousness about the issues we'll be talking about today in South Africa.
Cool. Thank you, Gabrielle, for that wonderful introduction. So yeah, I'm Zenaéca Singh. I'm a visual artist currently living in Cape Town. I was born in KwaZulu-Natal, the infamous sugar colony in South Africa, where indentureship was introduced under British governance from 1860 until 1911. And I'm actually the fourth generation born in South Africa, being a descendant of indentured laborers. My paternal great-great-grandfather arrived here in 1906, and I've been able to trace his lineage, but not so much my other grandparents. And so my artistic practice becomes both this personal and political investigation into this history of indenture. It's not a well-known history, especially within broader South African discourse. And there's a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about Indians in South Africa. And through my undergraduate studies, I had tools and the skill set to do my own research and digging. And I found that it was quite a traumatic and violent history. And so that only gave me greater motivation to speak about it, to use my practice as a way to confront the history. But it also became important for me to think about telling these stories of marginal histories so that they can also be in conversation with relational stories, but also in a way that we're not reinforcing stereotypes of indenture, and being able to tell them in a way where it's reparative and generative for future generations to build these narratives, and having a space or holding a space for these moments and experiences. Because a lot of the available documentation around indentureship is colonial records, which thankfully it's not a thankfully it's better documented than slavery, but all of these documents have the white male colonial gaze. And so a lot of it is being digitized now, especially in South Africa's context. And it's also important to think about, as we resurfacing these information, the images, how do we not reinforce that gaze? How can looking and engaging be an act of care and understanding each other's past, presence, and future? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Zenaeìca. Can we just jump in? Tell me, I mean, when we started to, when we connected and started to talk, I was so interested in how you came to use sugar. How and why sugar? Why sugar? Why acts of sugar? For those who are now getting to know your work, I think you're a really brilliant young artist. Tell us a little bit about why sugar has been so important in the trajectory of the work that you've been doing.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, it's as my practice, I wanted to confront the history of indenture. And so what better way to speak about this history using the same crop that was cultivated, sugar. And it's been an interesting process experimenting with it because it's an organic, natural material. I like the idea that my work is ephemeral to some extent, in terms of how the work will age and how it is made. And so I've been playing with sugar in different states of fluidity and solid properties, and really just playing with different metaphors to think about sugar as a stain, or how the history of indenture has been sugar-coated and the bittersweetness of it all. And so, yeah, I would just like to show you guys the different ways that I've been using sugar. And so these are works that I've made entirely out of sugar, where it's these paintings on a sugar paste surface that I make by hand and then paint with molasses. And these are family images that I have been translating. And I was really interested in the molasses because it's bittersweet. the bitterness obviously being in terms of confronting this history of indenture, but the sweetness and also the desirability to be seen, and also the stories of resilience and overcoming the hardships of indenture. I think it's also important to have these moments of intimacy and the lived experiences, which weren't really shown in colonial archives as well. And I found that colonial archives purely wanted Indians in South Africa to do their labor and simply go back, but that wasn't the case. And so the sight of family and these moments of leisure become quite evocative and reclamative as well. And another way that I've been working with molasses is thinking of it as a stain, and sometimes I use it on cotton and wanting to pull relations between indenture and slavery and how they're both, the nuances between these two different labor systems, because indenture is somehow framed as a form of free labor because of the introduction of the contract or the garment. But that simply wasn't the case. It was a very precarious labor system that was very punitive and dire as well. And so the materialities were quite interesting in thinking about it. And what I've done here in some of these bodies of work is also looking at colonial photography, which obviously had a very particular violent intent, and thinking about it being resurfaced now. What do we do with these images, especially being a descendant of these images? How does the looking become an act of care? And these were another series of works where I had stained digital scans of archival images. And it was quite an interesting performative aspect where through the heat of people engaging with the work, the layers of the molasses melted and dripped off. So it also becomes this living and performative thing. And I think it's also a conscious engagement that we need, and especially with dealing with these marginal histories. Another way that I've been using sugar is casting it as a form of sugar glass. And so I've been creating the series of works that I like to call windowscapes. And it's simply by casting sugar or heating up sugar and water to different points of crystallization and caramelization and embedding images in it. Or sometimes I'll cast sculptures with the sugar glass. And it's interesting in terms of how the sugar holds its form or loses its form, and it's in fluid and it's in liquid time, which I found to be quite interesting in terms of thinking about both colonial images and servicing familial, private moments. And I was also really interested in sugar glass because it's also known as breakaway glass. It's something that we use in the film industry for stunts. And so it's also interesting in thinking about breaking the gaze. And yeah, really trying to push these different metaphors and analogies that with sugar. And it's been quite fun. Yeah. And I've also developed a recent body of work in thinking about the gardenscape as well. And for me, the garden was an interesting site in thinking about our sense of rootedness and belonging of South African Indians, where I was playing on the idea of the root with the plant root and the roots of the ships. And in this installation, these paintings are actually double-sided, being stained with molasses on the back, contrasting contemporary and past colonial images, or some paintings have been crystallized in sugar, or the surface has been sugar coated. And these pots, I actually made them myself by hand, and they're actually made entirely of sugar, where it's that same consistency of using a sugar cube, where it's just making like a beach sand consistency of the sugar and casting these pots. And so it's an interesting way in terms of how, we recreate these objects, playing on representation of objects. But especially what it does with these pots, it causes a slowing down of time in terms of how we engage with these plants. And also just think about relations to land, especially leisurely relations to land, as opposed to the exploitative plantation scenes that one confronts in looking at the history of indenture. So there's a lot of interesting things that have been pulled from here. Yeah. And these were another example of my sugar glass works where I've casted ships. And yeah, thankfully I have this on display at the Phoenix Museum of Migration in terms of thinking about the ships. And I was playing on the idea of the ship in a glass bottle, also inspired by Yinka Shonobara's work at London Trafalgar Square. But I called these coolie ships, and I casted specific ships that travel during indenture. And especially one of the infamous colonial records that we have is the digitized shipping list. And so thinking about how we use these registers now, it's also interesting to see. And the works also come quite speculative in terms of how the ship ages and how it melts. And so it's quite interesting in its state of fluidity and thinking about identity and notions of belonging. Yeah, so that's just some of the different ways. There's this work, Finding a Sweet Escape, that we'll talk about just now. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
We can, let's come back to that. I mean, you've given us
Yeah.
so much.
Nice.
So, I mean, I have so many questions about the work. But just to know, like, how has it been received in South Africa? How has it touched people in terms of its use of sugar and therefore all of these multiple meanings that you are remolding that have to do with sugar cane and all of those histories?
Thankfully, it's been very well received, and it's always such a pleasure to have opportunities to exhibit my work and put it out there. I think the most rewarding thing is the feedback that I get when people see and engage my work, and how they also pull different relations, be it with the photographs, family photographs as well, where sometimes I like to work with silhouettes just in terms of privacy, not being able to have consent of representing people and navigating that whole tricky aspect of things, but how certain scenes, and also there's a nostalgia of the molasses and that sepia brown, causes people to think back to other memories, which is always so interesting. Some people also relate to it from the Caribbean, which is really interesting. And also meeting other people, especially from in Kenya, where indentureship also happened, and how they also find a point of relation to it. And I think especially for the Indian community, for those that have managed to engage my work and I've managed to speak to, they're always just so proud. There's a sense of pride in order to be seen, which is quite lovely and heartwarming. Because I also find within broader public discourse, you don't really find yourself being represented. So I find the art making and the artistic practice has been a fruitful way to think about engaging these stories. Yeah, it's been great.
And the sugar also is the works you're making are temporal in particular
Yeah,
ways. They take on a life of their own in the environment that they're in. Can you tell us a little bit about what the life of some of these works are? You know, do they get moistened? Do they disintegrate? Do they change color? Like what happens? And what
yeah.
are you feeling and thinking about that?
All of those things happen, and it's quite exciting. Because there's still a lot of work for me in terms of thinking about how it ages and how it holds time. And so that ephemerality of it is really interesting, especially with the sugar glass work. What I would do is after, I guess sometimes it depends on the sculpture itself. If I want it to melt away, it's interesting because at some point it just stops melting and it will hold a negative shape. And it's quite interesting in terms of how the sugar acts. And sometimes if it's purely white sugar and it's very crystallized, it will hold its shape for a very long time. And so it's so interesting that it has its own sense of agency and that I'm not in full control of it. And sometimes it's frustrating, but I think I'm always just fascinated by the material and constantly learning more about it in terms of its deepening in color It's quite an interesting fact. It's called the Maillard reaction, and which is this reaction of sugar browning. It's what we use for baking as well. And so I kind of see it in my sugar glass works, where over time it's also browning. And I really like this idea of browning as well in terms of thinking about Indianness and coolitude as well. So
In fact,
yeah.
Browning seemed to be a key word. Browning
Yeah.
the archive, Browning in your work. Tell me about how you think about Browning, but also in a South African context, which is, has so many resonances, but is also so
Mm,
different for us in the Caribbean. Could you tell us a little bit about how you think about the word Browning and why,
yeah.
what meanings it has come to have for you?
Well, a huge source of inspiration is Chadash, and he wrote this wonderful, well, I believe his PhD was proposing this idea of brownness, especially because, to be quite frank, well, to sum it up, um, the construction of the Indian race in South Africa went hand in hand with the migration of indentureship. And so, with that being the colonial era and migrating and trying to surveil these new body of people, wanting them to be here for a short amount of time and essentially leave, which wasn't the case, it meant over-determining the Indian identity as other to yeah, to ensure that, not create a premise for them to settle, even though their labor is needed. And so, yeah, and being in democratic society now with the multiracial or rainbow nation, South Africa, I feel like there isn't really much of a questioning of the Indian classification. And so I was really drawn to Jodash's study of brownness and browning. And it's also interesting how it's also brownness is also used also in the Caribbean and also in Latin America, and how it becomes this whole relational thing in terms of thinking about marginal histories. And it's like this whole spectrum of identities, and it's not static. And we're constantly transgressing boundaries, which I think Browning is quite a lovely thing, a term to encapsulate all of these ideas. And it's also nice that the sugar is also kind of doing that in a way, or I'm trying to make it do that. So yeah, it's very important for me to also engage these understandings of identity that's not static, but fluid, and Browning for me symbolized that. Yeah.
So we have Jordash Elepen here. So Jordash, I hope we hear from you before the end of the session. And
Yeah.
some of Jordash's early papers, Brown Femininities and the Queer
Mm.
Erotics of Indentureship, and the Brown Photo Album, an
Yeah.
archive of feminist futurity. And Jordash, your book is now out, and I hope that we're going to be able to discuss it in one of these sessions, as well as your own work in this series a little bit later on. So this is really great. I wanted to, Zenaeca, take us to talking about jewelry for a little bit before we open
Mm.
up. I think there's a lot of people in the room who also are thinking about this. I think I saw Tessa Alexander, who is also a Trinidadian artist and who's been working on thinking about indenture through a range of visual arts. And then others who have written about this work, Dr. Nalini Mohabir, whose work has been very influential. Um, and Nalini, I remember us speaking a while ago about your conceptualization of a brown sugar diaspora and so on. And of course, Kanisha Prasad as well. So this is just great. So we're going to give lots of time to hear from people jumping in.
Mm.
Um, uh, let's talk about jewelry for a second.
Yeah.
So, Zenaeca, when I discovered your work, I mean, I was really fascinated by the materials that you use, the way that you're engaging indenture histories through the materiality of the sugar and the way that sugar can be used to make forms that then are challenging their original representations in so many interesting and layered and living, organic in so many organic ways. I was particularly interested when we were chatting in your work on jewelry. And that is because, again, the scholarship on, there's not a huge amount of scholarship on
Yeah.
jewelry, but I think many of us reading the field have been very influenced by the work of Joy Mahabir, who has been one of the people writing about jewelry for a long, long time. And I was I wanted us to discuss this engagement of jewelry. I find jewelry to be really important. Um,
Mm,
and there's also something, you started off talking about confronting history, and yet, but also about creating work that is reparative at the same time. And I've been thinking also about beauty, jewelry as beauty, beauty as humanizing, and
mm,
also particularly for those um, who were not considered to be valued um, for their humanity. They were just meant to be labor and
yeah.
docile labor. And also thinking about jewelry for me um, has been important in terms of seeing it as a form of folk art. And so, really thinking about what are rural folk forms of folk art that have come through indenture history that so many of us are drawing on in so many ways. And of course, Andel Gosein's cutlass has
Mm,
been a kind of iconic example of that, and it's been written about by a number of scholars as well. And I just wanted, for those that are on our Zoom, I wanted to take a moment to show a couple pieces of jewelry or a piece of jewelry that we had produced in the exhibit and how it was engaging with the indenture histories to invite Zenaeca to be in conversation with that as well. So I'm just going to show that to us for 1 second. So you should be able to see it shortly.
yeah.
So the Botanical Afterlife exhibit, which has led me to really think about these issues much more and to use this as a forum to be in conversation with others producing this work and to also expand the conversation, not just between us, but to make it available to of as broad as possible a group of those who are making work, thinking about work, just looking at it, finding it meaningful in all kinds of ways. And so for our audience here, keep in mind also that these conversations are posted on the IGDS YouTube channel under the conversation channel Post-Indenture Feminisms and are available for teaching, for sharing, and so on. So, Zenaeca, when we had started talking about jewelry, I was mentioning to you the piece of jewelry I created. It was handcrafted by Mitchum Weaver, who is a multi-generational jeweler in Marabella in Trinidad. And that this piece is made from silver. It's quite heavy. And I wanted to use it to take the baju band, which is typically you can see it in many, many archival photographs, and it's typically worn above the elbow, and it's also typically flat. If it wasn't made out of silver, it would be made out of tin or some kind of alloy, and and generally had a design around the outside, but was flat in the middle. And so I wanted to take this flatness um, to use it as a metallic canvas in order to take this piece of beauty, this piece of folk art, this piece of something that was so important to Indian women in the way that jewelry has had so many multiple meanings. So Joy Mahabir talks about jewelry in terms of women's labor, um, labor resistance and liberation, and of course also in terms of things like savings, and 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 use something that isn't a canvas, like a Western form of canvas, to tell the story of our engagement, our historical engagement with landscape. And so you can see, for example, the piece starts on the other side, and I will show that in a second, and continues with a woman who is cutting cane, and you can see that the cane also there, so that reference to the botanical as interlocked with our histories in so many ways. This image of the cane cutting woman actually comes from a photograph by Garnet Eiffel in a book that was co-produced by Garnet Eiffel and Professor Brinsley Samaru, where Professor Samaru did the text and Garnet Eiffel did the photos. And so this is really building off of that. I also included rice, and moving away from cane in particular, I wanted to focus on the plants that were valuable to indentured Indians themselves. You know, rice is so important for sustenance, for ritual, for
Yeah, it's
so
a
many.
staple.
Yeah, exactly. And also came with them, was brought with them, rice grains. And so you see the rice there. And then, of course, the history for me to kind of make sure to tell the history of Muslim women's resistances as well, because the stories of Muslim women are often not emphasized in indentured histories because they came in smaller numbers and so on. But to see them as radical and protesting figures. So in this one, you can see the ship. A ship comes and then a story begins to emerge, not just of cane, but also of other botanicals that are important for fueling independence, livelihood, resistance, and so on. And on the back, you can see the wave. This wave is particularly referencing the reference to the Mad Sea that you hear about in the crossing of South Africa and the Cape. Zenaeca. So it's interesting because right at that crossing was considered to be a very tumultuous part of the
Yeah.
journey. And so it's interesting to be having this conversation with you today. And then the piece ends with a reference to education, not in a teleological way, but in terms of how resistance comes to take different forms. And indeed, today, how much we both create and draw on scholarship, how much writing, novels, fiction, poetry, how we have expanded the forms of resistance through a broad range of forms of labor. And so this piece sought to innovatively reimagine the baju band as a metallic canvas on which Indian women's histories could be engraved, and to make jewelry more valuable for more than what it says about savings or beauty. You know, as a site, creating it as an archive itself, a metallic archive, a site of history. And just before I hand over to you, because I really want you to show the jewelry that you're doing, which I found so tremendously exciting, is just to say that the cane cutting woman is deliberately meant to challenge who we think is represented by the cane cutting woman as well. And in this case, it represents Gauri Rampersad, who was unable to read, but was a absolutely brilliant businesswoman and who turned her labor into family wealth. And she is the grandmother of my partner, Ikta Rampersad. And she always says my grandmother is a cane cutting woman who couldn't read and write, but was economically and financially a genius. And so it's to think that also when you see these images and you think you know what story they're telling, that you may not actually know how complex or how contrary to our stereotypes those stories may be. And then the rice, which was significant for women's nurturing, as you said, Zenaeca, a staple, autonomy and empowerment. We, along with Abigail Hadid, and all of these images are from brilliant photographer Abigail Hadid, who was provided creative direction for the exhibition and all of the photography. And we went down once and she went down repeatedly and photographed rice farmers, rice planting, rice reaping in Navet, and also Sukwaria Ramnarain, who was married from 9 years old and whose family continues to plant rice today. And so we went down to the fields of Uttam Ramnarain for the photographs of rice, the portraits that were in the exhibit. And then, of course, the protesting Indian woman with the spirit of rebellion in the idea of a Muslim genealogy of my mother, Patricia Jamila Khan. And then finally, the path to education, which so many mothers turn to give their opportunities their daughters did not have. So, Zenaeìca, it was because I wanted to, because I was thinking about jewelry when I saw the work that you were doing. I was so intrigued by how you were using jewelry as well. So we have a moment for you to share that with our audience, and to call the spirit of Joy Mahabir, who very much has been someone whose ideas I've engaged with. So please, Zenaeìca, if you could show us a little bit about that jewelry work, and then we can talk about it until we close a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your work. It's such a poignant example. And I think it's so important to also have beauty as a form of representation as well. It's so impactful. But yeah, to quickly touch on my work, Finding a Sweet Escape is a large-scale installation, and it's inspired by stories of indentured women running away from plantations, and you could hear their jewelry clinking away in the distance. And so it's either that moment of them either being caught or just being able to run away. And I was so interested in that moment of freedom and trying to encapsulate that complex sense of agency that Indian women had at the time. Because in colonial archives, we don't see that. We don't get their stories, what it was like living on the plantations. And there were so many laws implemented as well to try and navigate Indian womanhood, and also to try prevent families from settling in the colony. And they were also known as coolie laws, and women were seen as concubines as well because they weren't recognized. Hindu and Muslim marriages weren't recognized, so they were seen as concubines even though they may have been wives. But the positionality of women is also so important to this installation because in the colonial archive of indenture, they're seen as dead stock or dead weight because their labor wasn't seen as ideal for cane cultivation. And it's also kind of informed that stereotype of the coolie worker being a male worker. So you don't see those images of women working in plantations. So especially when I saw that in your Jahaju band, I found that to be so striking and so important to see the strength that these women had and endured. And yeah, so it was either them being these passive women, or they were seen as scapegoats, and the scarcity of women, they were seen as prostitutes or lower caste. And so there wasn't really a nuanced engagement of Indian womanhood. And so I found the scene to be quite important in terms of thinking about how they navigated life on the plantations, where there would have been marriage laws, especially in terms of thinking about controlling Indian wives in the colony at that time. But there were also loopholes in these laws because they didn't want to set out these full parameters so that Indian wives could settle and join their husbands on plantations. And so it's interesting to see how in these loopholes, women also had the means to just also get up and leave whenever they had enough. And something also important to note about life on the plantations, it was very hard to recruit women. And there were these ratios, they were called sex quotas, of having 30 women for every 100 men that boarded. Initially, it should have been 50-50, but that was very difficult due to Hindu or Indian religious and the social taboos around sea travel, it was ultimately a breaking of caste. And so it was quite difficult to fulfill these sex quotas, and essentially women were lured or kidnapped. And so I wanted to position and center their positionality in this in terms of how they were essential for this dispensation of indenture, in terms of justifying it as a morally legitimate practice. Because if women were there, it could ensure the social life of indentured workers on the plantations. But it was much more to that. And yeah, honoring the vulnerability that they were put in because of how these colonial patriarchal views of womanhood at that time. And so that influenced me to create this installation with 3 components, using the sari, the white sari as well, because white is what we would use for funerary rituals. And I've also treated the sari with sugar in different ways, where it's sugar beads that I've made, blending the sugar into the cotton, again, thinking about the conversations between indenture and slavery. And then there's these sheer saris that I've made, or chiffon saris, where the pallu bit is crystallized and it holds quite a huge weight. And that pallu bit is also what gets draped over your shoulder. And so thinking about the weight of this history, the strength and endurance of these women. And then the other 2 components were the jewelry, where I casted bangles and facial jewelry in the sugar glass, and it's encased within resin and slowly melting away within the space. And that was also inspired by colonial photography of indentured women, where they were merely described as Indian women bedazzled in exotic jewelry. Nothing about the person, her name, where she's from, how old she was, nothing about her. And so it was very striking. And so that component was, or that object of the jewelry was very interesting and striking to me as well. And then lastly, I wanted to cast marigold garlands, which are also from a sugar glass, and they're very heavy. They weigh about 15 kgs each. And so the garland is also something used both for marriage and funerary rituals, especially it's a common thing to have a marigold garland around pictures of the family members who have deceased. And so, yeah, it was interesting in terms of having these different objects and signifiers to think about social death, and just the precarity of this whole situation. And yeah, it's quite a large immersive installation in terms of wanting to imagine what these saris would have looked like as it was flowing away in the wind. And I think the smell and the scent of the caramelized sugar or the molasses being quite bittersweet was also quite interesting in terms of how you would navigate the space. And here's just a close-up of the materiality of the garland slowly melting away, and how one of the sugar jewelry pieces currently look, where the resin also does quite an interesting thing with the jewelry, where you would expect this hard, durable, like heavy-duty materiality of resin to hold itself, but it's interesting that the sugar kind of eats away at the structural integrity of the resin. So it's also an interesting process of trying to preserve this, but also the ideas of preservation is interesting to me in keeping with the ephemerality of these works. But it's kind of held the shape of these jewelry pieces. And also it's a whole process of applying the resin and trying to keep the shape of it. It actually takes away a lot of the details that I've sculpted into some of the jewelry pieces. And yeah, it's been a very interesting process. And these works especially are ephemeral. Although resin was applied to this, it was just to kind of keep the remnants of having the jewelry pieces up. But I think especially for a work like this, having it ephemeral, aging, and how the sugar starts to act as well as it slowly starts to melt and drip away, it's quite interesting, and it's at also such a slow temporal pace in terms of thinking and speculating about what that moment looked like. Yeah.
I'm just giving our audience a chance to take in your images as well. The turias and the bearers, and you also had made earrings, if I recollect, olive
Yes, the
shape.
dream has.
And I mean, what's interesting as well is that uh, historical records in general are so masculinized, and yet everything in this room feels um, so much more woman-centered, that and also um, and feel so much more textured, you know, that you can feel the materials, you can see the granular nature of it, and that in all of that materiality is a history being told. So
Thank you.
thanks so much for these images.
Yes.
We have a really great audience in the room, which means that we could have a really great lime. And so I want to open up to so many people here just to say, please jump in. We have enough time to hear from everybody and to go back and forth for Zenaeca, not only to answer questions, but also even if you don't have a question and you just want to jump in with ideas, um, please do. So we're going to open it up now to the audience, and to see who wants to jump in and say anything. Feel free just to jump in. No need to put up your hand or anything like that. Hi, Nalini.
Hey, thank you both. This is just such an incredible conversation, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you for organizing this, Gabby and Zenaeca. I'm so happy to see your work and yours as well, Gabby. Um, you've given me a lot to think about in terms of indentured womanhood, in terms of using sugar as a material that challenges the colonial archive. In, as you said, it's um, the fact that it dissolves, it melts, it rots. There's a different temporality to it that might challenge this everlasting or idea of everlasting singular truth of the colonial archive. I think is really important. Um, Not really a question, more just I'm thinking out loud. But as I listen to you both, I'm thinking of Tao Goff's article on gastropoetics and sugar works. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Zenaeca, but it's a fantastic article. And she's thinking through sort of digestion as a metaphor, and the digestive dealings of sugar, of food stuff, as challenging the undigestible of the imperial violence embedded in the archive, and also thinking about sugar then as a way in which we can grapple with Afro-Asian entanglements in the Caribbean that's around sugar and sugar plantations. But I think because the history of labor was more segregated, obviously due to the history of apartheid in South Africa, I'm wondering how sugar resonates with the broader community in South Africa through your work.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting because a lot of the remarks that I get with my work is that a lot of people thought Indians were here as traders. So they would know a lot about passenger Indians that came to South Africa at their own expense. And so it's a lot to do with the confrontation of the history, and it's quite interesting. Then global relations are made from that point. But also in terms of the South African framing of indenture and the sugar industry as well, it kind of also created like this racial hierarchy between Indian people in South Africa and Black indigenous communities in South Africa at that time, where the Black peoples were stereotyped as enslaved, or they were too lazy to work on the sugar plantation. So that's why the British had to bring Indians in to do the labor, because they're more hardworking, but also so orientally strange. So I think within those racial divisions, it made it harder to actually connect with it. So I think it's great now that having a platform and holding space for these conversations and relations to be made, it's been quite interesting. Yeah, but it's been a lot more global relations in terms of sugar. People also think sometimes it's salt, and so it's also quite intriguing in terms of when people engage with the work and they find that it's sugar, it's actually sweet, and it unveils a whole conversation about what they associate sugar with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Nalini. And I had mentioned you're theorizing also of the brown sugar diaspora as well. And I don't know if you wanted to share about that with anybody. So everyone, Dr. Nalini Mohabir is at Concordia University, but also spent a year as faculty at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies in St. Augustine as well. Maybe you just want to talk a little bit just about your work around theorizing sugar as well.
Sure. And I just wanted to acknowledge that that year at IGDS was very formative in my career, and I'm so happy I got a chance to work there and to meet you and to meet, I see some people here, Catherine and who else? There was, and Renelle and other people that I recognized. So I've been thinking with Andal Hosein's work for a little bit, and he, I think, has been thinking about love and desire as a way of reclaiming humanity that has been, taken away through indentureship. And brown, I think, is an interesting concept to think with. Of course, as Gabby was alluding to earlier, it has many different shadings within the Caribbean. But if we start to think about it diasporically, brown is different than, say, the term in Canada, where I'm located, might be South Asian, which ties you back to a post-partition India, which is not our history, because we've, as descendants of indentured laborers, left before that partition happened. So before there was a creation of multiple South Asian homelands. So brown gives us something a bit more diffuse and a bit more nebulous and maybe a bit more liminal as well. So it kind of speaks to that in-betweenness of labor between forced and free, but also between labor as doing those jobs that that brown people, whether South Asian or Mexican or Filipino or whatever, are doing, that are precarious, that are temporary, that are often through temporary work visas or contract visas and so on. So I think this idea of brown and combined with sugar can be quite generative. Thanks for that invitation, Gabby.
Yes. Zenaeìca, did you want to respond? Or I think Jordash is here and we ready to jump in. Did you want to respond to Nalini, or should we keep going?
I think we can keep going. Thank you so much, Nalini, for sharing that. I actually wasn't familiar with your writing on brown sugar diaspora, so I think we know what I'm going to be doing now after this webinar.
I put some links in the chat as well, everyone.
Yeah, so I've been copying and pasting.
Jordash, over to you.
Yeah.
Hi, Gabrielle and Zenaeca and everyone else. I recognize so many people on the chat, and this is so exciting. Thank you for organizing this talk. Zenaeca, it's so lovely to listen to you talk about your work.
Thank you.
Interestingly, I became aware of your work as I was finishing the book. And so I'm like, oh my God, like I need to write about work now. But there's a couple of things that I just wanted to mention and to probably draw out a little. I really loved the way you talked about the kind of materiality and temporality and malleability of sugar work and how it browns and how it ages, how the colors deepen. And it also really reminded me of how in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a humid climate that reminds me of the Caribbean, family photographs age in the same way. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to draw that out because I think there's something about the materiality and also the malleability of the family photograph. And also, what's interesting to me is that within the work of artists of indenture Indian origin in South Africa, the family photograph features very, very prominently. And so to think about the family photograph as a kind of like personal, intimate archive, but also as a feminine archive, right? And I think that's really, really important. And I really liked the way you talked about Browning and Browning the archive. The other thing that I wanted to like to kind of talk a little bit about because your work is so important and this work that we've seen emerging in South Africa, like the Kuti Collective and Alcadas and the other members of the Kuti Collective, your work and some of the other kinds of works that's coming out, is really doing something with troubling this notion of the colonial Indian in South Africa that we continue to live with. And so there's two things I wanted to draw out. How I don't know if it's a question or just comments, but there's something about how the work disrupts this national imaginary of the Indian as the trader class. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering how you think about this disruption, how you think, but not only this disruption, but also this relationship. And then the other thing I wanted to kind of explore a little bit further, because when you talked about sugarcane, so I grew up in the sugarcane plantations. And and I think we probably grew up not far away from each other. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting is that historically, the sugarcane plantations, and I think even in the contemporary moment, when we think about it in terms of the aesthetic and stuff like that, it becomes racialized as Indian, right?
Mm.
And that very racialization of the sugarcane plantation as Indian excludes how the plantation economies have shifted, where in today's world, in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, along the Indian Ocean, a lot of the sugarcane plantations are now owned by formerly indentured workers, and the labor is done by Black African migrant labor.
Yeah.
And so I want to push you a little on that relationality between Black and what I call Afro-Indian
Mm.
because um, it's interesting to think about the kind of broader transnational diasporic relations. And there's a history in South Africa of the ways in which, through literature and theorizations of this experience, we've kind of done the work of like creating the connection between indentureship and transatlantic slavery. And oftentimes, what we forget is how Black Africanness, South African Black Africanness functions within the very formation of what we call the Indian in South Africa.
Mm.
And complicates even the kind of aesthetic ways of thinking through all of this. But it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful to look at your work and to think about brownness also. And I really like the way you evoking brownness as like fluid, as kind of like creating a kind of form of relationality. And I think one of the things that complicates this in the South African context is that we have a population known as the colored community, who
Mm.
in Afrikaans are known as brainos, right? And brainos
Yeah.
means brown. So, but also the relationship between the Indian and the colored is also very intimate and complex, right? Because Indians were actually categorized as coloreds until 1961 when
Yes.
the category of the Indian shifted to become its own racial category within the the colonial apartheid racial hierarchy. So I can see also why sometimes there's a kind of like knee-jerk reaction to using brownness. But I'm very interested in a brownness that encapsulates both what we would call the Indian and the colored population, because and it also is interesting because when you think about how coloredness comes up in South Africa, the category is actually related to slavery in the Cape. And when you think about
Yes.
slavery in the Cape, most of the people in the initial years of Cape slavery who were enslaved alongside indigenous people who were
Yeah.
indentured and African people who were indentured were actually from South Asian countries.
Yeah.
So it really troubles the very ways we think about race in South Africa.
Definitely. And something that I was also thinking about in terms of wanting to push this idea of brownness further is I looked into Homi Bhabha's culture of differences and his ideation of hybridity and how it's reading against colonial thinking and how the psyche in terms of determining racial classifications and differences and playing around ideas of mimicry and what that means, especially and thinking about the Oriental subject, it's so important, and I like that it's disruptive, and I think it's important that we do that work that's disruptive and pushing boundaries of what we understand by these classifications, especially with it being used today. Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the fact that especially now post-indenture plantations as well, with it being owned by indentured workers and the labor now being Black labor as well. It's something so important to be made, and hopefully I can start creating more work to acknowledge those relations as well. And I have exciting projects coming up where I'm going to Mozambique to look at the sugar plantations there, which Hewlett's and Illovo also own, which are the prominent sugar companies here. And I think, yeah, these ideas of brownness, hybridity, it's so important. And doing that decolonial work of thinking about how our identities have been made, and especially how it's so relational to all these different identities as well. And funny enough, I never thought of Braino as brown. So that's also something to look into. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jordash. That was excellent. And I think, again, really interesting for us to hear in these transoceanic conversations, because our contexts are indeed quite different. The floor is open for anybody else to jump in. And while anyone else comes on, just wanted to let you all know a number of links are in the chat. And I've posted links to a number of articles that have maybe been mentioned or referenced today. And Renelle White is here and has just been posting as well, thinking about Richard Fung's film Dalpuri Diaspora and the links between the symbolic and loved coolie food, roti and sugar, and remembering her aunt making sugar roti when they were kids as a sweet treat, maybe a poor version of Peshwari naan or something, but sugar roti. So I think, I mean, that's interesting as we talk about it as well. And then little later down, talking about how Indian bodies also change tones, shades, or their brownness with aging, with context, and so on, so that brown bodies are also themselves organically evolving with the elements and with time. And so there's a way that even with your painting over with brown sugar, with molasses and so on of the family photographs, is both the people in the photographs themselves, and your act of painting with molasses are all aging in ways that have coherences. So thanks so much for that, We're now
I just wanted to say one thing while you were talking about molasses. Like, what's also interesting about molasses is that it's sticky.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's that stickiness of molasses in your work that's gesturing towards like other forms of relationality. And I want to think about that more, but it's just beautiful.
Zenaeca, did you want to respond in any ways to any of these? And as Ronelle is pointing out, colorism is still alive in the Caribbean. So
Yes.
brown itself is contested across race and color.
Molasses is so sticky and the smell is also so poignant where I even get sick of it sometimes and I have to paint with a mask or whatever. But I like that idea of stickiness. And I would always think about it in terms of thinking about the sticky residues of the colonial archives. So I think it's also great to unpack it in terms of thinking about its relationalities and how, I think something that Jadesh really brought up is in this construction of the Indian identity, with it being at the time of life from colonialism into apartheid and trying to construct these different racial classifications that are distinct and different from each other, and also creating this hierarchy. So many relations are made within that wasn't initially intended by apartheid or colonial administrators, which that's where this disruption is taking place. And I think it's so exciting and important. And also the issue of colorism, I do think that's still something quite predominant in the Indian community as well, where I would have family members praise me because I'm fairer. So it's especially within the Indian community, notions of whiteness being like or wanting to desire whiteness, it's quite interesting and very important.
Kamala Tiwari, who's the president of the Hindu Women's Organization, is posting in the chat that she still has a bottle of Caroni molasses. Caroni being, by Caroni, we're referring to a site of sugar production that's very, very symbolic in all kinds of ways. So Caroni molasses, which she takes a teaspoon full of every now and again. I love how, these, I mean, for me, what's important when I had begun just 2 years ago, so for a very, very, very short time, thinking about the botanical, I was interested in how the botanical can be part of acts of memorialization. And whilst in my own work, I was challenging cane and the cane scape, and looking at the other plants that were very meaningful to indentured workers coming, bringing their own histories. Still, when you think about plants, they have all of these resonances. They are forms of sustenance. You eat them in multiple forms. They take multiple forms from, as Mr. Tiwari is saying, a teaspoonful of molasses, but at the same time, you can use it in the artwork that you are doing that in so many ways, as you're saying, is confronting history, recreating archives that are telling stories that you want to emerge from those archives, even as the materiality of the work itself is allowing those archives to be ghostly in a way that they are, in fact, because they are so imaginative. And yet at the same time, in your case, sugar carries, and then brown sugar carries all of these other symbolic meanings. And so for me, it's so interesting that sugarcane as a plant, a colonial monocrop in this instance, can nonetheless, over history and time, and particularly in work being produced about indenture, that this plant can just be, as a co-migrant and co-settler with us in these histories, has so much to remain so much a part of our lives. And that's the thing about the botanicals, is that they traveled with us, or they were part of our lives here and continue to inform as completely different species, thinking about these as interspecies, uh, interspecies relations that have so many resonances. Tessa Alexander, an artist who's here, is posting a chat. Tessa, I don't know if you want to talk at all, or anybody else before we close. Tessa is saying that she remembered being given molasses as a child as a form of medicinal boost. Also thinking about the fluidity of identity and comparing it to sugar, which also changes form, dissolving as well as burning or browning in cooking. So in Trinidad, we talk about browning the sugar before you use it to make stews or, stews of various kinds, with rice, like in pilau, or stew chicken, or so you're browning, you have to brown it as well to give the food a brownness, also the stew a brownness. Molasses and tulum, like it's just there's so much to discuss.
Yeah,
The floor is open
definitely.
if anybody else wants to jump in. Well, Zenaeìca, I think I will leave the final words to you. Any last thoughts that you have about the work that you're doing that you'd like to share?
Gosh, I'm just so incredibly grateful to have this space and meet so many wonderful people who I've been reading so much of their work. I'm kind of fangirling at the moment, but such wonderful, productive conversations are coming out. And I was recently asked if I've exhausted my use of sugar in my practice. And just thinking now about like how many different relations that were made and pulled out now, I'm definitely not done, and I'm totally fine with being known as the sugar artist. But I don't think that puts me in a box in any way. But this was absolutely wonderful and so productive in terms of thinking about decolonizing archives as well. And I also really love your work and how you've been thinking about the botanical afterlife of indenture and how these species are coexisting as well, and thinking about, I think it's great in terms of encapsulating dynamic qualities of identity and how our histories have come together in relation to each other. So yeah, thank you so much for doing this work. And I'm looking forward to the different relations that you're going to make. You're forming your own archive right now, and it's wonderful to be a part of it and see it grow. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Zenaeìca. Everyone, I was really excited when I saw her work on Instagram, where you can easily find it at Zenaéca Singh. And as I said, I was particularly excited by Zenaeca's jewelry, because I had also been thinking about, hey, Tessa's hand is up. So Tessa, go ahead before I wrap.
Yeah, no, because I wanted to say something, but then you said, let's wrap up. So I just put up my hand in case it was okay.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to ask Zenaeìca if it's I love your work, and I'm really happy that I was able to tune into this conversation. And so thinking about the sugar and thinking about the indenture. So I myself, I am a hybrid, because I when in Trinidad we call it Douglas, so I'm half Indian and half African, and then my work has been not just thinking.
Oh, sorry, I lost you for a minute.
Tess, you dropped out for a second.
Somebody was calling me and I was trying to decline the call. I'm so very sorry. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, you know.
Right. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, because of course, the history of South Africa with the sugar is also, they also had enslaved people at some point in time doing some of that as well. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts of collaborating with, because I actually was very interested when you mentioned that a lot of South Africans didn't realize that they had indentured Indians in South Africa, and they thought most of them came as traders, which I I found that really very interesting. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts on any kind of collaboration, working with a South African or somebody who's has a history of ancestry of enslavement, and kind of comparing or working alongside those kinds of conversations as well, pertaining to sugar and exploitive labor and violence of colonization. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. And I think something that's so important within the visual field is to keep a network, but also to collaborate. So I'm definitely open as well to look at the connections between indenture and slavery. And another seminal work to my practice was Hashimi Bana Young's idea of illegible wool. And she was thinking about this idea, or also confronting the stereotypes of indentured Indians and enslaved Africans, and troubling the binary between the two, with also, like how Jadash mentioned, with the Dutch East India Company in the Cape, and with the slaves that were brought up being mainly from Southeast Asia, but they're termed as Cape Malay now. And then also the initial one of the earliest form of indentured workers in South Africa were Khoisan or other indigenous peoples. And also, while indentureship was happening late in the 19th and 20th century in Natal with the sugar plantations, Mozambicans were also brought over to work alongside indentured Indians, be it in sugar plantations. I think it was railway work. So yeah, I'm definitely open to collaborating, because there's so many connections to be made with this, and also bringing sugar in relation to different materialities like cotton or whatever else, or other types of spices as well, I think would be very interesting and generative. Yeah.
Thanks, Tessa. Tessa Alexander is Trinidadian artist who's also working on this, and this on theorizing post-indenture legacies through her artwork, and your work can be found on Instagram as well, Tessa. Thanks for that. Zenaeìca, maybe while I close, you could just put the reference to the work that you just mentioned in the chat before we wrap. So I was thanking Zenaeìca just to say that it's a privilege for me to be in conversation with people who are producing art. It's helping me to learn. I especially love the opportunity to feature younger artists, another generation of artists, to make space, to give your work a bigger platform. That's a real pleasure for me, and to learn from your work, from others' work, from the contributions here. My goal in doing these conversations was to actually bring together folks who wanted to talk about these issues, wrestle with ideas, and share and support each other's thinking and praxis. So this has been very much that kind of conversation, for which I'm grateful that there's a community of persons who are interested. Thanks to those who had put comments in the chat as well. I think those were very rich also, and really appreciated. I'm hoping our next conversation will be with Surinamese descended activists, descended artists, who are living and working with the Botanical in the Netherlands. And so just to return to the way that plants as a species that accompanies us in our past and in our present are part of our practices of memorialization also. And plants and their, and their life cycles, and the outcomes of their place here on Earth with us. I'd especially like to thank, before we close, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and particularly Catherine Chan, who is also a well-established artist in Trinidad and Tobago, and Lesedi Lagal, who have been very helpful at advertising, at managing the Zoom and all of that. Just to reiterate that these are going to be up on the IGDS YouTube channel, and so can be viewed again. I hope, my goal is that that artists and scholars and others from around the world will turn to these conversations produced from the Caribbean in transoceanic connection for teaching and research and for inspiration as well. And so that these will be a resource that the Institute for Gender and Development Studies can provide. It's been great to see students of the IGDS here, alumni of the IGDS, other artists. I must mention Gabrielle Singh, who was involved in the Botanical Afterlife of Indenture exhibit as well. If you've come in, you should see many links. It's like a bibliography almost. Many links for our YouTube channel, links to the digital tour, virtual tour for the Botanical Afterlife of Indenture exhibit, and to a number of the articles and books that have been mentioned here today. Thank you all. Zenaeìca, it's been a real pleasure to hear from you and to learn more about your work and to have this opportunity. And I hope you feel lifted and encouraged and surrounded by a community as we look forward to the work you continue to produce.
Thank you so much. And yes, definitely. This is very heartwarming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.